Well, let's begin this roundtable 3. Each one of the panelists here is going to have 10 to 12 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes of waste, but I was asked to try to organize around 10 minutes, so you have some time to give the floor for the people here to make questions as well. And in this time, Dr. Lluís is going to begin to the end because he has just finished to speak. So I as well would like to explain that I receive a WhatsApp of Dr. Lacerda, that is advisor of the president of BNDES, that he was called to go to Brazil and he cannot come. I can imagine that a lot of things is happening now, and he was not able to come here today to this round table. So let's begin by Professor Lianos, and after we're going to follow the sequence. Please, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation, and obviously what I will say is my own personal views. I do not engage the competition tribunal, and I very much enjoyed a presentation by Luiz before. I mean, extremely interesting and very thoughtful, and I definitely agree with his conclusions. I think it's important to, because I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer, so I will take a little bit of more legal perspective. Although I will try a little bit to touch upon some issues in economics, hopefully it's not going to be too wrong. But I think, when we discuss about industrial policy competition, I mean, these are, and we need to make eventually some choice at some point, because there may be tensions between them. I think it's quite interesting to think about the social contract in the way that it has been formed in each jurisdiction, and obviously the place to look for the social contract is usually the constitutional text, right? And it's quite interesting that in Europe for, let's say, since the 1960s, we have built a sort of competition state, in the sense, and I'm using the term by Bill Jessup, in the emphasis put by the drafters of the treaty on the importance of competition. Actually, the only article of the treaty that refers, my knowledge, on industrial policy, Article 119, is mentioning that this has to be happen, and obviously this we have to restructure these national markets in an open market economy with free competition, right? So even, the industrial policy provision is basically talking about the principle of open market economy and free competition. And of course, this was a choice, a political choice made in the 1960s in opposition to the so-called techno-nationalism of industrial policies of different European member states. I mean, let's not forget, but this was a quite important change. I mean, let's not forget that the coal and steel community was basically an industrial policy in the sense that the idea of the whole thing was to pool resources, scaling basically the coal and steel industry between France and Germany in order to develop an economic advantage that will enable to generate profits that could be invested in the post-war Europe and somehow to build Europe after the war. So it was a quite important choice made by the treaty drafters in the Treaty of Rome about basically the importance of competition policy. Now, when we think about the industrial state, and I'm using here, so you have the competition state, you and the industrial state. The industrial state is not just about public, industrial policy, right? And in his seminal book in 1967, Galbraith, basically, which was about industrial state, was focusing not just on public type of interventions in the economy, but also the importance of the large multinational M-form corporations, conglomerates, and vertically integrated firms, and their role in managing basically the savings. So in creating these huge internal capital markets that will take the savings and obviously invest them in the development of the economy. So and at the time time there wasn't really talk about scale. It was, according to Galbraith, it was more about managing demand, create security, basically, in terms of demand for long-term investments and the development, basically, of investments. Now, and of course, this view about industrial policy being a mixture between public interventions and private interventions is not absent from the most recent discussions about industrial policy. I refer here to a recent paper by Andreoni and Chang, basically defining, industrial policy as a political economy process of coordination and alignment across the public-private spectrum towards feasible and desirable techno-economic trajectories and associated policy interventions. And I think this is quite important, obviously, to have in mind. Now, in Europe, there's been a lot of discussion recently about, the intersection between industrial policy and competition in view of the Letta and Draghi report. I think the Draghi report had more emphasis, maybe the fact that it came in September, the Letta report came in the summer. But in any way, so the idea was that some people were saying the alt-right of competition law policy debate, they put the emphasis on the fact, Draghi is really trashing competition law, is basically saying we did everything wrong, it's against aggressive competition law policy. I don't really think that Draghi basically says that, and I've drafted a post, on ProMarket explaining, by looking to the text, that this is exactly not what he's saying. I mean, the fact that Draghi is supporting the new competition tool, the fact that Draghi is basically supporting aggressive enforcement of the DMA, the fact that Draghi is basically supporting the increase of resources of competition authorities is a clear indication, I think, that Draghi is basically not saying that competition law enforcement is something that, was generating issues concerning the development of the European champions in industrial policy. And also, it's quite interesting to note that in Draghi's report, I mean, the productivity gap that exists between the EU-US is only in the digital sector. I mean, basically, he has a number of graphs showing that this is not really important in other sectors than the digital sector. And I will come back a little bit why you might have this gap in the digital sector. It might not necessarily be because of aggressive competition law enforcement. Actually, that this gap exists in that context. But in any way, I think what is interesting when we look to the Draghi report is that he emphasizes the role of competition policy as opposed to just competition law enforcement. So he's basically taking this broader competition policy perspective in all chapters of the report. Yes, he has a specific chapter on competition law, but basically competition policy is present in all the various chapters of the report, both Part A and Part B. And what is interesting here is that he puts forward this more dynamic, evolutionary, a growth-oriented approach, which I think is something that we will definitely welcome, and many of us have been, somehow putting forward on the fact that, it's not just about the competitive process. Competition is not just, an end in itself, it's a means to an end, and this is basically to develop a more inclusive growth and more responsible innovation, and obviously to satisfy the objectives of the social contract. Now, is industrial policy discussion in Europe something completely new? I think at the EU level, I would say I think we have seen a quite important resurgence of industrial policy discussion even before the Draghi report. I mean, during the COVID crisis, we have a temporary framework concerning the COVID crisis, the Next Generation EU, 800 billion euros that were provided temporarily to recover and repair the immediate economic social damage brought by COVID. We have the temporary crisis framework, which basically has been changed to the temporary crisis and transition framework. And obviously, there are their objectives of industrial policy, in Europe, energy support, in order to, leave the dependencies in terms of fossil fuels, etc., and matching aid possibility. We have open strategic autonomy being present in all the efforts of the EU concerning semiconductor, all the development of the important project of common European interests, also, something that is basically focusing on open strategic autonomy. And of course, we have the external aspect, I would say, of the foreign subsidies regulation by basically all these initiatives with regards to foreign direct investment screening, and of course, the possibility of the EU to protect itself as a measure of trade policy and protect EU from potential actions by third countries. Now, however, I mean, all is not ideal, and basically these are some kind of notes that I would like to make, more questions, and a little bit of criticism to the Draghi report. My first criticism is the Draghi report has been very much based on wisdom that has been received by the usual quarters. I mean, there's basically no one or very few people from stakeholders from economically peripheral regions of Europe. I mean, no one from Central, Southeastern Europe. I think that's quite important. And to a certain extent, if you really want to have and frame an industrial policy, design industrial policy, you need to obviously include everyone. So not necessarily, just somehow put a federal type of EU industrial policy slogan to the policies, industrial policies of the larger, Western EU member states. Secondly, and I very, very much follow what Lluís was saying before, I think there has to be more emphasis on bargaining power in supply chains. I found it very interesting that Draghi hasn't really necessarily put forward in the competition law chapter the importance of concepts like value chains or ecosystems. I mean, it's as if, the economy is basically, the economic activities is done in the context of markets or large M-form corporations, but actually most of the economic activity nowadays is done in the context of networks and of firms, ecosystems or value chains. And I think this hasn't been put forward. And there, value chain positioning and creating, bargaining power in the context of value chains, I think is extremely important that we need to take into account. And I think what I think would be the interesting thing to do is to start introducing this meso and macro level in the competition law and economics discussion. We have been so far focusing on the micro level. Although, there have been some changes recently with ecosystemic theories of harm, we've seen in some merger cases, or, you had the Dow DuPont case and the Bayer-Monsanto, the emphasis on at the industry level type of innovation, rather than just at the market level innovation. But I think it's very important to focus more on the meso and macro levels in our analysis. The second thing is that we need to think of competition law as a catalyst for technological opportunities. I have one or two more minutes, yeah. And I think there it's quite important not to somehow get into this very simplistic opposition that some have to basically say more regulation means less, innovation. I mean, South Korea, is a jurisdiction where it has really very strong data protection. PIPA exists since 2011. I mean, the GDPR is since 2016, and still, it has a very prominent place, despite, I would say, of this strong data protection and privacy protection in the global IT and computing value chain. So I think it's not really something that is basically because of the fact there's a regulation. But of course we need to think about why South Korea has that, because maybe of the important roles of these South Korean cables that offer these internal capital markets with the knowledge of the technology that are able basically to move savings to be invested in new technologies, and also the enforcement of competition law to upgrade to create competition in key inputs for the South Korean economy. And I think these are things that need to be discussed a little bit more prominently in the new transfer technology regulation and guidelines of the EU, which need to integrate more this meso level. And final remark I wanted to say is I think a little bit on this issue of scale and savings. I think what is important here is to understand that maybe competition law and policy and the fact some people say that we had aggressive enforcement. I don't think we had aggressive enforcement. Actually, we had very few cases in terms of numbers the last 15, 20 years with regards, for example, to digital platforms eventually. I mean, some people have said that. But I think it's quite interesting to think about how is these innovations funded. I mean, it's quite interesting to oppose the US perspective, where you have 25% of the investments are done through bank loans and 75% by capital markets. It's actually completely the opposite in Europe. It's 75% by bank loans and 25% by capital markets, right? And I think this is quite important. Maybe, is one of the problems, the fact that we don't really have a capital market, a European capital market that leads to higher cost of capital, and that's also why we need to, and this is what Draghi basically puts forward, the idea that we need a lot of public investment, because, it's not possible to attract, the amount of private investment. The cost of capital is going to be more important. So, and therefore, it's not really that much about scaling, I would say. Of course, scaling is important, but it's also about, how you manage the savings and what is the best way to provide basically these savings for investments. The other thing is also that we don't really have, in terms of private capital markets, as prominently, in Europe, venture capital and private equity that is really knowledgeable of the technology. And I think this is an important problem that we need to overcome. And of course, the other thing is also, and this is more of a question I have, I haven't really thought about it very, very, very much, but I think it's interesting. When you look to the period of mergers and acquisitions in the different waves, there has been a very important wave in the night between 65 and 75, right? And there have been a number of papers basically saying that the reason why there has been a lot of conglomerate vertical mergers at the time was this imperfect, so the efficiency of the internal capital markets of these large firms. Because the external capital markets are not as efficient, the internal capital markets are much more efficient, therefore companies are basically somehow expanding and through mergers and acquisitions. And that changed after the late 70s with new technologies. External capital markets became very efficient, and therefore that somehow changed. Now the question is the fact that we have now these big tech companies, so we can see these big tech companies as internal capital markets that invest basically in various activities. Is it really something that might explain, in a way, why most of the startups they abandon IPOs and they basically want to be acquired by these tech firms? It's interesting. Until 1996, there's a very good study by Bruno Pellegrino. IPOs were really like the most important way for startups to to basically get funding, and that changed after. And why that changed, maybe it might not necessarily be that they're more efficient. It might be that maybe because of their market presence, this important dominant position they have, is almost a suicide basically to get an IPO and to kind of contest their positioning, and therefore the best way forward is to be basically bought by these big tech firms. But in a way, what I would like to say is maybe it's not everything about scale. It's very important, of course, and we know network economics and all these kind of things, but we might probably need to look a bit more carefully to this internal capital markets issue, and then this way of managing savings, as an explanation and possible factor to take into account when we design competition law and policy. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ioannis. Let's go now for the Commissioner Diogo Thomson.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I would like first to express my gratitude to GDEC for the invitation to be in this panel with these distinguished panelists. And for me, especially, it's an honor to have a professor and ex-commissioner Prado as a moderator. When I started at CADE almost 18 years ago, as a young prosecutor of the legal service, I had the luck to work and learn with a team of brilliant commissioners, economists, such as Professor Prado and others, like Professor Paulo Furquim and Professor Farina. So myself, commissioner of today, thanks very much for that time. Additionally, I may be some repetitive for some of you, because I will revisit elements from a paper that myself and Paulo presented yesterday, and also because I pretty much agree with key points of the lectures of Professor Luiz Saurí and Professor Lianos. Industrial policies have researched in the 21st century as a strategic tools for foster innovation, sustainability, and economic resilience. Unlike the traditional models of industrial policy that were characterized by protectionism and direct state intervention, Modern industrial policies focus on creating environments that support technological development and drive innovation. This shift is driven by challenges such as digital transformation, geopolitical uncertainties, and climate change. Competition policies as well have evolved beyond the traditional focus on ensuring only market efficient and consumer welfare. In the digital economy, they now face complex issues such as the dominance of the economic power of the digital platforms, network effects, and data control. So I think the primary challenge for both of these policies is striking this balance between fostering technological growth through industrial policy and maintain the competitive neutrality through antitrust enforcement. Modern industrial policy seeks to transform economic structures by promoting sectors and behaviors aligned with public objectives. So we emphasize fostering innovations, ecosystems, rather than merely shielding established industries and national champions like in the past. A key principle of this approach is the use of conditionalities. In that sense, competition can play a role as a conditionality for the government support. So if you tie public policy, industrial policy with measurable outcomes like innovation and fair competition, there's a place for competition to contribute with the industrial policy. There's global examples of that. The European Green Deal, I think it's a good example, but also the US Chips and Science Act recent. It's an example of an industrial policy that ties this government support with the outcome of competition and innovation. So this example highlights that modern industrial policies are not about picking winners and losers, but about creating conditions for innovation and growth. The relationship, although the relationship between industrial and competition policy has historically been marked by tension, industrial policy always have focus on supporting specific sectors that often create market distortions and barriers to entry, and competition policy seeks to preserve open markets. And these tensions have intensified in digital era. So with this economic power of great platforms, great digital platforms, we also have true network effects and data control, higher entry barriers. Some of the new regulation about digital platforms try to strike these challenges. So for example, the DMA impose obligations on gatekeeper platforms to ensure fair conditions for smaller players and entrants. So this reflects a broader trend toward integrating competition considerations into industrial policy frameworks and to avoid monopolistic outcomes by incorporation competition safeguards. But also antitrust frameworks should adapt to promote innovation without stifling market dynamics. In that sense, in that context, Brazil faces a unique challenge, in my opinion, particularly because we could, a fact that we could term it like a low technology trap. The country relies heavily on incremental innovation in traditional sectors without significant advancement into high-tech or disruptive technologies. We have a lot of innovators in some sectors, but we still over-reliant of this high-tech and disruptive technologies from abroad. And one example of this low technology trap is the challenge that the Marco Civil da Internet, which is often recognized as one of the one landmark worldwide that is in digital governance. However, yet is not translated in broader innovation gains for the country. So even though this landmark regulations ensures net neutrality, privacy, and freedom of expression, and set a strong foundation of digital rights, translating that into public policy is still a challenge. Other initiatives like the Brazilian AI plan demonstrate also a strategic vision for inclusive technological growth, and shows that we still have this challenge of how to implement that. In that context, CADE, as the competition authority, can play a critical role in integrating industrial and competition policies. Beyond its traditional role of antitrust enforcer, CADE has the potential to adopt a more strategic and proactive approach to address these complexities of the digital economy. So CADE first have to strengthen its ex-post monitoring and enforcement capabilities to deal with digital markets and digital platforms. Should also develop a regulatory framework that allows CADE to proactively prevent market concentration and promote competitive dynamics in the digital markets by regulating ex ante, for example, great players or great digital platforms. And third, by collaborating with other regulatory bodies and also in the formulation of public policies. CADE can align broader industrial policies, such as the Brazilian AI plan, with competition goals and competition outcomes as a conditionality, for example. So there is a significant, although there are significant challenges in integrating industrial competition policies, CADE has a role to play and to collaborate in that environment. So balancing industrial policy goals, such as technological sovereignty, with competition policy goals, such as open markets, remains a complex task, but Brazil should prioritize evidence-based industrial policies that focus on digital infrastructure, skills development, and fostering innovation ecosystems. Public-private partnerships can certainly play a critical role in driving this agenda, and competition policies must adapt to the realities of the digital economy by addressing network effects, data power, and platform dominance. Conditionalities tied to state support can help align these industrial policies with competition goals. So, to conclude, integrating industrial and competition policies is essential for positioning Brazil as a leader in the digital governance and innovation. And for that, a comprehensive framework that balances regulatory fairness, innovation incentives, and consumer protection can transform the country into a global example of a resilient and equitable digital economy. And in that context, I think CADE has a pivotal role in driving this transformation by adopting a proactive agenda of enforcement and also a collaborative approach with the formulation of public policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Diogo, and first, thank you for. I also have good memories of this period with Farina, Cueva, and others at the time, Furquim and others. Let's now, I'm going to give the floor to Professor Carlos Frederico Leão. That's not only the Eduardo's boss, but my boss as well. So he's the director of the Instituto of Economics, our link. So I'm going to give it the floor for him.
Thank you. First of all, I was going to do another presentation, but when I heard what Luiz was talking about, he was talking about decarbonization, and I have a whole work on decarbonization. So I thought I should talk about decarbonization. Okay. We are working with decarbonization and industrial policy, oh yes, and like my worry is about the paradoxes and contradictions that a policy, industrial policy that has too many goals undergoes. Okay, so here I can show you the three main goals of most of industrial policies that are being built in Brazil and in other countries. And they have three main goals. One is like income and performance, goal. There's a goal for social inclusion and employment, and now they have included a goal on decarbonization. And it's a very important goal because we don't want to burn in the next years. So in order not to burn, we should have some measures not to burn. Global warming has an important characteristic. It's a public good, so it's non-rival and no exclusive. So those are the characteristics of these goals. And what we have been watching up until now is the Jevons paradox. That is, cost reduction implies increased demand. So we have increased demand for carbon, though we have been very efficient in reduction of carbon consumption per unit of product. We have since 1980, our carbon emissions per unit of product has reduced 50%. So we have been very efficient in reducing carbon intensity. However, carbon consumption has increased in these years. So that's something, that's Jevons paradox, which, now we have surveyed the literature on industrial policy for decarbonization, and this survey has driven to four main conclusions. One is that industrial policies should be place-based. That's something that Luiz was talking about, competition policy as well. So it's locally, it's country-specific, sector-specific, and we should look at reality. The second problem is that we have a trilemma that I just talked about. Sustainability, social inclusion, and industrial structure and performance are contradictory goals, or may be contradictory goals, and how we deal with that. And third, a good implementation of industrial policy requires state capabilities. I will show an example a Brazilian example of this, and that's something that really challenges you. And the fourth is that we need political will. So Brazil has lacked political will in the last, during Bolsonaro's government. So that's something, we didn't have a decarbonization policy there. Now, I think that the United States will go through something like that, and political will is central for a decarbonization policy. I'm going to talk about the beef production chain, which is one example of what is being going on in Brazil. Mainly in production chain, what's important here? Here we have the breeding of the cattle that holds 16% of value added in this production chain. And here we have slaughterhouses that hold 25% of value added in this production chain. And here we have retail that holds 30% of value added in this chain. So it's really a production chain. And where should we act as a state in order to have decarbonization? And industrial structure here really matters. What happens in farm production? Farm production, we have 160 million heads of cattle on a similar number of hectares. It's very spread in the, we are extensive culture in terms of cattle production, but it's very decentralized. 2 million of these farms have under 100 hectares. So it's very decentralized. It's very difficult to control and to enforce policy in this sector. So we are left for slaughtering houses. That's where we should act. And here is the first thing. Concentration maybe is good. Because 40% of the slaughtering capacity is held by 3 firms. Okay, and that's when you look for competition policy. Well, maybe it's good to have a concentrated sector here because you can pressure these firms. Well, we have carbon emissions in this sector has two origins. One is deforestation, and the other one is enteric fermentation of the cattle. Okay, they emit methane, and well, but the cattle business in Brazil is responsible for around 2/3 of all Brazilian emissions. That's really where we should act. And so we have some monitoring capacity, but we have no enforcement capacity. And that's where we lack state capabilities. And that's where we lack political will. We had a government that had no worry about climate change, and now we have a government that worries about climate change, but we have a Congress that doesn't act with worry to climate change. And here we have international pressure. And what's the international pressure? Who has clear restrictions to deforestation? In European Union, USA, and UK. And who have no worry about deforestation? China. And that's 54% of our exports. I think that this week we have heard a lot about this. What really matters to Brazil is China, the China market. 25% of the production is exports. Okay, but the new entrants, we have new entrants as importers, but worst, we have new slaughterhouses. And new slaughterhouses don't obey climate restrictions. They don't obey deforestation restrictions. So that's something that, again, goes against a traditional competition policy. Just one other thing that I should. This week has shown us that the restrictions to deforestation have nothing to do with climate, but protection of markets. So that's something that's a contradiction of industrial policies. Modern industrial policies that tackle decarbonization are really traditional industrial policies that argument for decarbonization in order to protect. That's something really that appears. But here is the second. And how can we reduce methane emissions? Well, one is feed and ruminant digestion. We have a lot of startups on that matter. The second one is management of cattle raising. And the third one is the promotion of alternative proteins. That's plant-based meat. Most of the startups of the plant-based meat have been acquired by Brazilian slaughterhouses. So I don't think we are going to have plant-based meat. Not that I like plant-based meat, because we don't know really what it means in terms of health and in terms of environment. Still, we don't know a lot about that. So really, what can we learn? Well, but here is another matter for competition policy. Should we allow acquisition of these firms? And the same matter, and this exposition was really should really tackle decarbonization policy, not competition policy. But in terms of competition policy, what I can think about here is that the important matter, the important problem about decarbonization policy is that carbon is a public good. is also here, because the startups are international companies. They are not located in a particular country. So no national competition policy can tackle this problem. And what we can learn, while policy has been able to tackle local aspects, there is little political will to guide a decarbonization policy in the meat production chain. And third, there is need for state capabilities. More important, international regulation of the sector are linked to, in a greater extent, to home countries' social and economic interests than to the reduction of GHG emissions. But that doesn't happen also only in the meat sector. If I look to the steel industry, I think that Luiz was talking about the steel industry in Europe, and they have a very, very aggressive decarbonization program. And they have invested a lot in decarbonization. And the German steel industry has a negative capex right now due to the decarbonization policy. They have, the state has subsidized steel industries in such a measure that capex is negative. And that makes, that for instance, finishes and really is a very strong limit to Brazilian steel. So it's really a zero-sum game. We're talking about a zero-sum game here. So, and what about the trilemma? Decarbonization industrial policy should state their goals. It's very important about that. And second, when environment is taken into consideration, it sounds more like a restriction than a goal. So as a restriction, you should state what's the restriction. And third, most importantly, if the public good is global, national industrial policies are not likely to tackle the important features of this problem. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's go now for Silvia Fagá, that is Vice President of IBRAC. Let's give the floor.
Well, thanks so much, Professor. Thank you, everyone, from this panel. And I want to thank also Professor Eduardo Pontal for inviting me here. It's a pleasure for me to discuss with this audience as well, and especially this topic. And in the last days, we had a lot of chance to understand a little more about competition and about industrial policy or public policy in general. And I would like to start taking a step back, remembering how was Brazil like 30 years ago, until 30 years ago, when only the macroeconomic agenda was important because we had hyperinflation and the government was concerned basically with that. There wasn't any room actually for a more specific public policy directed to industrial organization, to microeconomic agenda. And only after that, only after 1994, because we had the real plan, the stabilization plan here, and because at the same time we had our economy was starting to get open, and then we had the privatizations, and because of that we had also regulatory agencies being created. Then we started to have a more active agenda related to industrial organization, related to microeconomic impact in the economy. And since then, I think we've been maturing and getting older and getting more experienced with this discussion. I think the antitrust policy as well got stronger during these last 3 decades, and in parallel of other agencies getting stronger, and in parallel of the agenda, the industrial organization agenda getting stronger as well. And I think actually the fact that macroeconomic agenda got really important in the past, it's still considered something more important nowadays. And I was just discussing yesterday when we are debating the name, the possible name of a new central bank director. Usually the only concern is how do they think about inflation and interest rate. Nobody really discusses what's happening or what this person thinks about competition or about regulating the sector or industrial policies to develop the financial sector. People only concerned about this person's view about exchange rate and inflation and interest rate. So, and we do have a lot of good examples from the central bank, like PIX that we've been discussing a lot in the last sessions in the last days. A lot of intervention of the government in the format of regulation that has important impacts as in the competition from the competition perspective, and also from the public policy perspective in general. The PIX process not only increased competition, as you mentioned in many other panels here and in the discussion in the last days, but also made it possible to make it visible for people who were invisible for the public policy in general, because they didn't have access to any kind of bank account or any kind of visibility, in the sense they don't even had any kind of documents to be seen by the authorities, especially when the authorities want to support them with some kind of public policy. So bringing those people to the financial system is another aspect of enhancing public policy in general. So PIX had this power in parallel with the increasing and the entry of new fintechs that manage to use this opportunity to consolidate themselves in the market. So PIX is an example of how the industrial organization agenda is related to the more broader agenda of public policy and the government. But we also have a former example in the past. Even the Rio Plan was able to, which was a macroeconomic agenda, a very important one, that it was decisive for the economy that you have today in many aspects, but at the same time, right after the Rio Plan implemented in Brazil, we faced a lot of changes in the food industry in Brazil and in the prices of food for the Brazilians as well. We face a strong reduction in the real prices. In the 3 or 4 years right after the Rio Plan was implemented, we faced a 20% reduction in the real prices of food in Brazil. It was I remember the data because it was a research that I developed with Professor Farina like 25 years ago when I was her academic intern at the university. And we tried to discuss why it was happening. It was a CEPAL study that we were developing at the time, and then we realized that one important feature that made all the difference for the consumers to face these reductions in price was related to the new competition environment regarding the retail market at the time. Because during the hyperinflation period, we only had the chance to go to huge supermarkets to buy all the food. We only had I don't know who remember that period of time, but there were only huge supermarkets because everybody used to buy, to shop their groceries in the beginning of the month, because in the end of the month, your money wouldn't had any value anymore. So that was the type of supermarket that existed in Brazil. And right after the stabilization, and because we also opened the economy, and we faced a lot of interest in the market, and then the consumers started to go to their supermarkets more frequently, started to try new brands, new products, and because of that, you face a whole new dynamic in this competition environment, and it made it feasible for the food industry, and even the efficiencies that were faced in the agro-industrial chains to be shared with the consumers, because the last link in the chain had a much more vibrant competition environment, and this make it possible for the consumers to face this new level of price, and it helped the real plan to be successful as well, because when you have food being the focus of the reduction of prices, and the prices, the competition environment helps to keep the prices down, it helps to keep inflation down as well. So here you can see how industrial organization agenda can work together with macroeconomic agenda, and they need each other to be successful. Otherwise, you may face failure in both sides of or both agendas. So this is something that for me it's very important to bear in mind. And as mentioned before by the professor, having our goals really clear, it's very important, because as we were discussing last Saturday in the event promoted at IBRAC, we also faced, there was a discussion about open finance and open health, for instance. The open health could reduce the asymmetry of information, and in a similar way that we are facing the asymmetry of information be reduced in the financial system, which is very important to solve this kind of problem and to solve the adverse selection that comes when you have this asymmetry of information. But you need to bear in mind that the goals may be different here, because in the financial sector, the adverse selection brings higher prices, and it is probably the main issue that locking the consumer in each bank and make competition weaker. But in the health sector, we do have an adverse selection problem, but maybe the most important problem is the moral hazard that comes with the asymmetry of information. So I do believe that open finance and open health can be both very important policies that can develop and can enhance competition in both markets, but you may have different goals with this, or you should aim to have different results, because maybe these differences will lead to different results. So this is why it's very important to understand each details of each market and which goal you want to achieve with each kind of public policy. So I still have a few minutes, right?
3 minutes.
Oh, okay, so I'll try to go faster. So in this context, I strongly believe that, yes, competition policies is one of the foundations of industrial policy. As mentioned by Diogo, I do understand that you're facing a very important period of time in which the Ministry of Finance and its industrial organization agenda is totally related to probably one of the most opportunities that we face to increase productivity here in Brazil and increase the level of innovation in Brazil because of the digital market. Now, I think that the industrial organization agenda is getting really, really important because of the digitalization of the economy. And I understand that the regulatory framework that's being designed can be a huge opportunity for us to foster innovation and to foster competition, because as recognized in the Ministry of Finance report, productivity and competition, they work together, and they need to be together, and you need to have competition to have the process of sharing with the consumers all the gains that you're going to have in innovation, in reducing costs. So I do believe that you have this kind of effect here in Brazil. We have this kind of opportunity, at least in Brazil. And as an economist, I also want to highlight an important thing that can complement all the discussion we have until now. I think it's important to have more evidence and more data being discussed alongside with the theoretical and legal discussion about how to regulate digital markets. The report from the Ministry of Finance is very important, and I think it is very, very well written and produced. And a lot of experts, real experts, were discussing it. But at the same time, it's important for us to have more evidence of the impact of this regulation before implementing it. And I think we have a huge change with that. Here we have the Minister of Finance being represented. We have IPEA being represented. Yesterday they were here. We have CADE. We have a lot of agencies and governments representatives that could lead this kind of discussion together in cooperation because we think we have a lot of the data to do that. So I would like to leave this remark to provoke a little more debate about how to proceed with more economic evidence regarding this possible intervention in the market. So thank you so much, and also thank you for the opportunity of being the only female economist on the table. As we, a Women Antitrust President Network, I couldn't leave the table without remarking this. And I do understand that in the economist environment, it's really hard to find a woman. We face this problem all the time. So hopefully in the future, we'll have more equality in the sense, not only this kind of equality, and hopefully the industrial policy will be able to tackle this kind of inequality as well.
Thank you very much. And now I'll give the floor to Dr. Marcelo Guaranys for his consideration.
Thank you very much, Prado. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Such a high-level discussion that we are having during these days. It's good to be back to the competition and discussions like that. It's an honor to be with you. That was a commissioner by the time I was in the competition Brazilian system. Yes. So it's very good to be here again. Well, I'm a lawyer, economist at DEMAREST for the last 1 year, but I used to be an economist lawyer at the government for the 23 years before that, and I think that I can try to add to this discussion is a little bit of practical experience trying to implement public policies regarding competition, industrial policy, and trying to put them all together. In the last 7 years that I was at the government, I was trying to coordinate all the different efforts, first in Casa Civil, and after that in the Ministry of Economy. So it's very hard to try to do this in Brazil when you have two different cultures and two different mindsets in different ministries. So this is the classical organization that we have in Brazil. We have the Ministry of Development and Industry, and we have the Ministry of Finance. Ministry of Finance always the protector of the competition policy, and Ministry of Industry the protector of the industrial policy. So sometimes it gets almost religious, the discussion that we have. So people want to open the market, and people want to close the market, and it's difficult to put, how can we manage that? How can we try to have problems as sophisticated as you showed in your paper? So I think we are in a previous step on that, trying to how can we implement industrial policy with more competition view and a competition vector. So industrial policy in Brazil, I used to say that when I was in Casa Civil, my position was to coordinate different ministries in order to elaborate a public policy. So you have to put together Minister of Industry, Minister of Finance, Minister of Labor, the general prosecutor, and everybody to try to get an agreement. And always very difficult, because everybody from the private sector came to Casa Civil or to the government requesting three things: more subsidies, more tax exemptions, and more protection. It's difficult to have a general view how to improve productivity and competitiveness in Brazil. So when you go to the Ministry of Industry, this is what they are requesting when they're trying to implement, although they understand that it's important to think about improving competitiveness and productivity. And when you go to the Ministry of Finance, they always want more competition, and it doesn't matter what is the effect. Competition, like a religious too. I was part of this religion too. So, and now you also have some discussion about local content requirements that used to be part of the industrial policy in the past, and now is being discussed again. But again, how can we put them all together and try to think together in order to improve what Brazil needs? Now, we're still a closed country. We have low levels of productivity, and we have to increase that. When I was just trying to discuss trying to put together Minister of Finance and Minister of Industry in the same table and trying to have an agreement, like to try to reduce tariffs for a sector. Minister of Finance always wants more competition, so he wants to reduce tariffs. But Minister of Industry wants to have better conditions of competing in Brazil. So he wants to reduce tax, and Minister of Finance never wants to reduce tax. How? So tax reform was the answer for that. Have a tax system that was simpler and that could introduce more competition. But tax reform is very hard to do. We are now trying to move on that, and maybe we can have hope in the future. But we have to put them all together and try to walk them together. So, because if you want to wait one part to solve the other, you won't have a final solution. So what was the different approach that we did in the last years? So when we created the Ministry of Economy, during Bolsonaro administration with Minister Paulo Guedes, what we are trying to do is put them together and to try to change the mindset, to put competition together with industrial policy. They went to the same division. They went to the same part of that. So when people were thinking about industrial policy, they used to have in mind competition policy. They have to think about that. So they could not do the same kind of industrial policy that you used to do in the past, subsidies, tax exemptions, and protection. Were we able to do so and to change? I think that some part, but not at all. We saw different approach. We saw that we are not trying to choose sectors or choose champions, but try to implement transversal public policies that could affect everybody, try to increase productivity and competitiveness for everybody. Like trying to deregulate, try to reduce bureaucracy. By the end of that period, we are able to do what both sides want. We are able to reduce tariffs. By the time we could reduce the tax, the industrial tax, IPI. Yeah, we are able to reduce 35% of IPI, the industrial tax in Brazil, and reduce 20% of tariffs, import taxes in Brazil. So this was one answer, try to reduce for all. So you want to reduce the cost for industrial sector, but at the same time, we want you to have more competition from international side. This was a result of putting them together. This is very hard to do when you have them separated. A lot of us were in the government and know how difficult it is to be part of this discussion. I don't know who any time of their life has been part of the CAMEX discussion, the Committee for Foreign Trade, and trying to discuss how to reduce tariffs. It's like religion. It's impossible to discuss. What we need to do that, we need evidence. We need, as Silvia was saying, we need to have evidence-based policies, and we need to put evidence on the table. We could increase this discussion on CAMEX when we put a little bit the competition technology that we have in CADE in CAMEX, to try to discuss what is the market, what is the remedy, try to discuss and to be more restrictive when applying all the remedies that we have in foreign trade. So this is I think one of the good and important things of putting competition and industrial policy together. Even during crisis, it's one important part of the study of Professor Lluís. We were able to do things that were trying to not focus only one sector, but try to focus on everybody. So the emergency aid, the labor flexibility, the BEM, the benefício do emprego, de manutenção do emprego, everything that we tried to do was trying to put good public policies for everybody, to try to make them survive and they be able to grow back again when everything was open again. The same thing happened during war, when Ukraine was invaded. There was a huge discussion, and a lot of people here were discussing that, how to deal with the price of fuels. We'll have control. We will have a fund that will finance the reduction of the prices. But the answer was, well, let's reduce tax. We don't need tax by this time. We need to reduce tax. So it's important to decrease the level of costs that we are having right now in the sector, and then the consumers can be benefit by that. Well, after that period, we now have again, separate MIDIC and Minister of Finance, Minister of Industry, and Minister of Finance. But I think that some lessons we learned. So we now have in the Minister of Industry a secretary for, I never remember the name, Competitiveness and Regulatory Policy. Andrea Macera is the secretary for that. So inside Ministry of Industry, there's someone thinking about competition policy and someone trying to put, when we are creating industrial policy, explaining how important it is to have competition and how it's important to have this to increase the level of productivity that we have in Brazil. And Minister of Finance, we still have someone thinking about competition. We have the Secretary for Economic Reform that still have CI there, or still have someone discussing competition in sectors and being part of a lot of discussions that we brought to this table, digital markets, health, and it's good to have both sides, the industry side and the finance side, talking together and trying to create together public policy. I think it's very important that we can keep these two sides of economic policy working together. And again, important to have the continuous assessment of that. So in the last years, we also created the way to evaluate public policy. We are not used to evaluate the public expenditure in Brazil. We are not used to evaluate the regulatory impact assessments in Brazil. Some regulatory agencies used to do, but was not something that was spread all over the federal government. Now we have laws that make this an obligation. So the law for regulatory agencies and the law for freedom economy, they both required regulatory impact assessments. And we also implement the public expenditure review as part of our public policy cycle. We have to keep using that. So evidence-based public policy is a key for us having a better country. We are still a closed country. We still need to improve a lot of competitiveness and productivity. Then again, the question is how to improve the integration of the industrial and competition policy in Brazil. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I also would like to remark that I remember we worked together when I was a commissioner. He was at CI, I guess. CI at the time, and at the time it was the beginning to do some kind of cooperation. That was a very rich period of my life. Now let's give the floor for our reaction again to Luiz Saurí. Please.
Well, thanks again. I've spoken already a lot, so I guess I should I should be short now. But let me just make some references to some of the comments that have been made. Indeed, I mean, when I was talking about the unfinished market integration in Europe, and I think Professor Lianos has said it very clearly, one of the questions is financial markets, the importance of venture capital. You have been also talking about open finance. How to channel resources, financial resources, towards the right projects, towards the right investors, that's going to be key. And this is a structural type of approach. It's not targeted, it's not distortive. So I think it's very much in line with what Marcelo Guaranys has just said. I felt very much reflected with when you were describing the relation between competition and industrial departments. I don't think it's that different up there. I also have this feeling that it's like in a financial institution, it would be the commercial department and the risk department, where competition economists are also always in the risk department saying no to everything, and the commercial department coming with some crazy operations that you say, okay, this is not going to go well. I think we are working on getting over that. And this is a constant, exercise. I think one of the things that I've tried to do since I've been acting as chief competition economist has been precisely to strengthen a lot the relations with the chief economist and the director general of growth, the chief economist and the director general of trade, the director general, the chief economist and director general of energy. And I think that's particularly important because even though these different departments in any government, in any commission, have different political objectives, and therefore it's normal that the approaches are different, if there is someone that can agree, it's those that are looking at the data, those that are looking at the facts, those that are looking at the evidence. And these are the economists. So if we are to work together, and we are supposed to work together, the easiest way to start building policies that bring together all that the different departments in a government have to put together, I'm afraid it's the economists. I'm afraid it's us. So when we don't agree between us, that starts to be boring, because then it means it's going to be more difficult. There is one thing I agree, but also one thing I disagree, of what Professor Rocha said. So first, the emphasis on the local context, I think that's very important. In the question of decarbonization, why is it easy for the European Union to be behind decarbonization? Because we have something to gain. I mean, actually, we are very dependent on expensive foreign fossil fuels. So by going for renewables, we are going to gain, or we hope, we are going to gain some mid and long-term cost advantage. The transition may be costly, and we want to make it efficient, but the end point is an end point that makes it appealing to us. Maybe the situation in Brazil or in situation in other places where fossil fuels are more abundant, where dependencies from foreign fossil fuels are less acute, the situation is slightly different. The trade-offs are different. So we are facing different trade-offs. I totally agree. And that means that policies and approaches will be different. And it makes sense it are different. The global situation is the same. Local contexts are different. What I would not agree is that it's necessarily a zero-sum game. I think it depends on how we do it. It can be a zero-sum game. I mean, game theory tells us this, no? But it can be a non-zero-sum game, because there are spillovers, because there are externalities, because actually, and I put it in the slides, the more the merrier. The more we have decarbonization policies that have positive externalities for all, the better. So here we need to start thinking about how we can, when we see the IRA, for example, when we see the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, instead of the first reaction being, oh, that's protectionism, maybe the first reaction should be, okay, what's the good part of it? What's the decarbonization incentives in it? Because that we should all agree, that part is good. Then the protectionist part, and that's where coordination comes in. So what are the options for coordination of industrial policies at international level, so that we can realize the spillovers and the positive externalities and minimize to the extent possible the protectionist reflexes that would condemn us to a zero-sum game. And there I'm seeing the OECD here. I think the roundtable on pro-competitive industrial policies earlier this year was very important. And I think that this type of initiatives, I mean, if there is a forum that could be useful in that, I think the OECD, for example, it's one of them.
Well, we're going to have time, 10 minutes for 2 or 3 questions. I just ask to the people, we're going to make the questions in sequence so the table can answer all of them as fast as we're going to get some time. But before that, just to give information, for the lunch, it would be necessary to get a new bracelet, paper bracelet. This one, the red one. Without this, you cannot eat, and everyone. Okay. Well, let's go to the people here. Who would like to make questions? Please.
Thank you for the wonderful roundtable. My first question is for Professor Lianos. So you mentioned that the Draghi report doesn't really take into account the periphery of the European Union. How do you think the Draghi report would be different if it had taken into account the periphery, Central Europe, and Eastern European, Southeastern European countries? Can I ask another one or no? Yeah? And another question maybe for everybody is, maybe for Commissioner Diogo first. do you view the Digital Markets Act and DMA style regulation as competition policy, if not competition law, or as industrial policy? And if you view it as industrial policy, what kind of industrial policy would you characterize it as? What are its objectives? Does it have to do with digital sovereignty, equity, scaling of national business users, or perhaps something else? Thank you.
Any other question? The people are really running, I guess. No? Okay, let's then, Professor Ioannis.
Very interesting. I mean, my point was more about the participation in the sense. So I don't really know how it would have basically been different. I guess it might have been, but I cannot claim that I know it would have been. So eventually, I think it's quite interesting to note that countries like Poland, for instance, or in Eastern Europe had a much higher growth rate, which might be explained obviously by the starting point as well. So, which could have been quite interesting to see what have done well. Then we have countries like Greece, for instance, who face quite considerable crisis, so economic crisis, social crisis. And inclusion, social inclusion was extremely important, right, in order to be able to keep the society alive to a certain extent. So that would have been quite interesting, I guess, insights for the Draghi report. I have to say that Draghi, at the introductory paragraph, at the introductory chapter, he puts, emphasis on social inclusion and the idea that we need to make trade-offs. Even his criticism to the GDPR should be seen as a way of, putting forward the cost, but also he mentions that there might be benefits as well. And this is something that we need to do a trade-off, and it's a trade-off every polity may be doing differently. What I wanted to say also, if I may, add something. So I think we should not get into the single institutional fallacy of basically, something doesn't work, therefore, we should avoid that. I mean, for instance, I've seen a lot of articles recently about the failure of the Northvolt type of, initiative, industrial policy initiative in Europe, with regards to batteries, and all this is really money thrown away, etc. But I think what could be the alternative, right? In the US, I mean, we have been open to from a trade perspective, but at the same time we invested in creating our own capabilities. In the US, as far as I know, they use tariffs to protect. So is it actually, if there is a choice between being open and having industrial policy, kind of, create new ventures and investments, and then put tariffs? I mean, I'm not saying that I know the answer, but I think, we need always to look what is the alternative, right? Because it might be not the perfect option, but maybe it's the least imperfect alternative, right? So I think that's something that Neil Commissar has been putting forward in his work, the single institutionalist fallacy, and I think it's very important to have this comparative institutional analysis, which obviously we have to integrate institutional capabilities. What a specific jurisdiction can do in terms of institutional capabilities might be very different from some other institutions, and I think that is definitely something important to take into account.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. And I would ask for my European colleagues to share his opinions on that too. I see the DMA as an effort from Europe to incorporate industrial policy goals into a competition regulation environment. And what is, maybe it's different, is to deal with these new objectives with an instrument that's not the traditional ones of antitrust. So it's a hard regulation or a hard example of regulation that has the goals of also incorporate industrial policy goals, European industrial policy goals. So the local context is important here. That's to say that we don't need to copy that, just copy that and paste here in Brazil. But I think it's a way to deal with this digital transformation, incorporating digital goals, industrial policy goals in the competition regulation. And as traditional antitrust legal frameworks are very much link it with the goals of efficiency and consumer welfare. Maybe this reform of the way that the European Commission deals with the digital transformation. It's a way to show that there's a new type of antitrust that we need to think about, and it's targeted to this new phenomenon of the big techs.
Any other question? No. So let's finish. But by the way, there's another one.
Thank you. It's to Professor Carlos. You told about that small slaughtering, small producers for meat, they cannot reach the decarbonization policies. They cannot, how can I say, adopt these kind of measures to their. But why this happen? Because they can't, it's costly, or because the regulation? And another small question is, like yesterday, France did a big announcement to the markets of meat in Brazil. So how it would impact this decarbonization policy here for us? Thanks.
Well, why smaller slaughterhouses? Because you cannot enforce them. So that's the whole problem. You have smaller ones, and they just acquire cattle from deforested areas. So that's really the reason you have, like, if you take JBS, which is very large slaughterhouse, if it doesn't obey regulatory legislation, it gets punished. But a smaller slaughterhouse, you don't see this slaughterhouse. You just see the meat being sold in the market. So that's the main problem. And about French restrictions, they were not. That's something very funny, because they could have said that the restriction was on deforestation, but they didn't say that the restrictions were on deforestation. They said that the restriction were on the quality of the meat. The quality of the meat, it's very good. So it's not the problem is not the quality of the meat; it's the deforestation. If they had said that the restriction was on deforestation, they would be right. Because we cannot. I have some environmental friends that don't eat Brazilian meat. Here, the Brazilians that don't eat Brazilian meat. They only buy meat from Uruguay, because from Uruguay it's certified that it's not from deforestation. But here in Brazil, we cannot guarantee that the meat you buy in the supermarket is not from deforestation. So that's the whole problem is that. And what I can say to you, if you buy from large slaughterhouses, it's less likely that is from deforestation, because the fiscalization and enforcement on these large slaughterhouses are very efficient.
Well, unfortunately, we have to finish. Now it's time for the lunch. I'd like to talk everyone. We're going to have another round table today. And by the way, this is another one. We're going to have 3 times more women than now, because they had this Maria Teresa, Professor Maria Teresa Leopoldo, Camila Pires, Commissioner Camila would be there, and our good friend Svetlana would be there as well. So it's not good enough, but anyway, it was an improvement. Thank you very much.